We did have 4 baptisms last Sunday. 4 baptisms. That's fantastic. It takes, believe it or not, the statistics say that it takes an average church of 100 people 1 year to have 1 baptism. And that's not doing so great. And I think we counted up, what was it, Tracy? I think 14. Was that with the 4 from last Sunday? So 18 baptisms this year. So that's fantastic. Yeah, super great. There's always room at the table for one more, and our responsibility as a church is always to reach one more. And we are in a Bible study on 2 Corinthians, and we're going to open that up. And I think I remember what verses. What was it? Chapter 10. Yeah, 10 verse 7 is where we're going to start. But hey, just a second to thank all of our veterans. Tomorrow is Veterans Day. You guys that have served, we appreciate you. We thank you for your service. And, thank you. It's one of those things that, you didn't sacrifice your life for your country, and we're so glad that you're here, but you were willing to. And we appreciate that willingness when you signed up or got signed up. Maybe the judge made you sign up. I don't know. But when you got signed up, you have to really think about what that may cost you. And we're certainly grateful to all of our veterans for that sacrifice, that willingness that you've displayed. We appreciate you. And, we just had an election, and I'm not even going to talk about it because I know everybody feels very strongly in our country, very strongly. And I get it, right? So we just had an election, but I want you just to think about, like, when you elect in the United States, when you elect a president. I mean, other countries do it different. Not everybody elects a president. Some people they just get a dictator, and that's what you get. But when you decide on who you want as a leader, whether it's senators, governors, presidents, whatever the office is, judges, there's a lot of people on that list. I had to do a little research to figure out who all these people are, and sometimes it looked like both of them could be pretty good. I don't know. It's hard to know. But when you look for a leader, there's certain characteristics that you tend to look for. I mean, you want somebody that's even-handed, but also strong and powerful, that projects strength, and, somebody that is confident and secure, but also somebody who is careful with what they say. And there's a lot, of pressure on leaders. It's a lot to try to live up to. But when you choose a leader, you want somebody who's strong, eloquent, and also powerful. And in this Bible study that we're in 2 Corinthians, what we deal with in this chapter, or a couple chapters, we're not going to be able to read all of it, but, Paul is being criticized by some of the people in the Corinthian church because he didn't come across as powerful or as eloquent as maybe some of the other people that they're used to hearing. Now, realize in their day, in this Corinthian world, in this Roman Empire, people really valued might and power and strength, and they valued wisdom and people who could, who were very eloquent with their words and could, really articulate phrases and turn a phrase. It's called rhetoric. And people really valued that. They would go and they would listen to these teachers in their forums, and they wanted somebody that would impress them with their turn of a phrase and with their brilliant ideas and their brilliant oratory skills. Paul was not that. He was not interested in that. It was kind of like if you were to judge me on how I'm doing right now based on maybe like Hollywood celebrities. You think, wow, Tom, you did a great job, but you're no Brad Pitt. You did a great job, but you're no George Clooney. You did a great job, but, you're no Mo, Larry, and Curly. Actually, you are Mo, Larry, and Curly. But, it wouldn't be fair to judge your preacher based on, even like the radio preachers, right? Like, okay, I try to do my best, but I know I'm not Chuck Swindoll. I know I'm not Alistair Begg. I know I'm not Billy Graham. I remember my dad telling me that one time. You did a great job preaching, son. I was like 25. He's like, you did a great job, but you're no Billy Graham. I was like, well, thanks. Appreciate it, right? Nobody else is either. Nobody is Billy Graham, right? And And if you compared the Apostle Paul with Billy Graham, Paul probably wouldn't come across as articulate. And I want you to know, he probably wouldn't come across as articulate and as polished as somebody like Charles Stanley or Chuck Swindoll. And I'm glad we all have those favorite preachers that, really, T.D. Jakes. When I listen to T.D. Jakes, I think, man, I don't even know what I'm doing, because that's preaching. Like, that's how you ought to preach it. If you start holding these people up who have this tremendous ability, what could happen? Well, you could get really discouraged as a preacher. Like, what am I doing, man? I'm not T.D. Jakes. I'm not Tony Evans. These guys are so polished. They're so amazing with how they talk. Well, the church was doing that to the Apostle Paul. Now, it's kind of a big deal and it's kind of not a big deal. Like, it's not a big deal on the one hand. I get it. Everybody has their favorite communicators, whatever. And whatever. But the big deal part of this is Paul's not just a preacher. He's not just like me. He's not just an average preacher. He's an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. He's tasked with not only starting churches, but also with correcting doctrine, correcting people who are incorrect, and writing scripture. And so when you start minimizing Paul as an apostle, and he's not really that articulate, he's not really that great of a communicator, he's not really that powerful, he doesn't really have a lot of wisdom. When you start downgrading him, the problem is you invariably start downgrading his message. And I don't think Paul would get up and fight for himself, but he will fight for his message. And so he has to do something in these last chapters of 2 Corinthians that nobody wants to do. He has to rebuke them and prove as best he can that he's qualified and worth listening to, and that what he says is important, even if he's not as polished as some of the people they're used to listening to, some of their celebrities, or what he calls your super apostles. You guys have super apostles, super duper teachers, apostles that you love, that are so skilled and so wonderful, but check the content. This gets back to this idea. It's not really the messenger that's important here. It's the message. It's not really the power of the communicator, but it's the power of the content of the message. Faith is important not because it's so strong, but because of the object of your faith. If you put great faith in a failed object like a broken chair, it's going to lead to problems. But you just have to have mustard seed faith, little bit of faith, if your object of your faith is accurate. And so Paul is going to remind the people that even if he's not the most powerful communicator, or not the wisest, brain in the room, that it's not really just power you're looking for. You're also looking for somebody who is surrendered to the will of God. Now, I need to read a verse or two. I've read this all week, so in my head, I have to share it with you because that's in my head, but it's not out there in the sermon yet. Okay, so where are we at? Chapter 10, verse 7. Look at what he says. You are judging by appearances. You're judging preachers based on appearances. And so preacher comes in, he's got this big suit on, and maybe you don't like that. I'm thinking like the guy with the big flashy shark skin suit, which is ridiculous. It's in my head. That's what I think, right? But then, maybe you're thinking of the preacher with the 3-piece suit, that graduated from whatever seminary, whatever you think is the best seminary, or if you don't know, whatever, Princeton, let's go there, Princeton Seminary. So you got, this. But that's just appearances. And be careful just judging your teachers or your preachers based on how they look or how they come across or whether they're quick with a phrase. You're looking for more than just somebody who is articulate. You're looking for somebody who has correct theology. You're looking for somebody who knows the Lord, who is actually a saved person. And believe me, not every preacher is a saved person. That's scary to think about. The Southern Baptists keep records on this kind of stuff. They probably keep more records than any other denomination. And one of the records that they share every year is that about 10% of the ministerial staff in Southern Baptist churches announces that they are receiving Christ as their Savior every year. So think about that. What it's telling you is that in the average church out there in the United States, there's probably a few ministers who don't even know Jesus. And it's no wonder the churches don't. The preachers don't. What chance does the church have if the preacher is not where he needs to be with the Lord, where they need to be with the Lord? So you're judging by appearances. And so then he's going to talk about boasting. And then let's go down to verse 12. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves when they measure themselves by themselves. Okay, so how do you know that these teachers and preachers are great? Well, what do? They compare themselves with each other. They say, well, how many are in your church? Oh, you got 250 in your church? Well, I got 300 in my church. Well, what school did you go to? Oh, you got a master's degree? Well, I got a master of divinity. Oh, what? And so they're comparing themselves with themselves. And so when you do that, you start to look down on one another, and you start to get very prideful or very discouraged because you don't measure up, in your opinion, to some of these other preachers. And Paul's like, this is so foolish. This is such nonsense. When one church is comparing themselves with another church, we're all the Lord's church. We're all his servants. We're all workers in his vineyard. Stop comparing yourself with one another in order to feel better about yourself. Compare yourself with the Lord. He's the judge. And this is what he says. He says, this is not wise. Verse 13, we, however, will not boast beyond our proper limits, but we will confine our boasting to the sphere of service God himself has assigned to us. What is he saying? If we're going to boast because what God is doing in our lives, in this world, in ministry. We're not going to boast because our little church is growing faster than their church, or our results seem to be more than the field next door to us. Compare yourself with God, not with one another. Look what he says, verse 16. So we can preach the gospel in regions beyond you. That was his goal, is I'm not just working for you. I'm working wherever God wants to send me. For we do not boast about the work already done in someone else's territory, but let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. If you're going to be proud that God's even using you at all. Rather than just pointing to all of your effectiveness and all of your results, that's wonderful. But if you're going to be proud about something, be proud of God and be proud that God is using you in his kingdom. Rather than more proud than you are because I've got greater. You know who had the best results in the Bible? One of the worst preachers ever. Seriously, one of the worst preachers in all history probably had maybe the best results, better results than even Jesus had sometimes. Jonah. Jonah was the worst. He didn't even want to go. His prayer was that God would condemn he didn't want the people to be saved. And yet God used him in spite of himself. And he preached the shortest message in the Bible, 40 days and Nineveh will perish. That's all he said to him. 40 days. You got 40 days and then God's going to destroy you. And he actually wanted God to destroy them. He hated the Ninevites. And yet God used that simple message. The timing was right. Jonah was the wrong person in the right place at the right time. God was using him even though he didn't want to be used. He literally did not want to go. Remember, he went the other way. He's the worst. And yet he had the whole city repented. A whole Gentile city of Assyria, the capital of Assyria, the capital of the enemies, repented. Now, was it because Jonah was such an amazing man of God? No. It was in spite of him. Why? Because God is bigger than the messenger. He's bigger than your failures. He's bigger than your flaws. And he can use terrible people like Jonah to accomplish his will. Look at Samson. Samson's an exact opposite of Paul in many ways. Samson has all the strength, all the power, all of the blessing, all of the giftedness. And yet what? His heart is not surrendered to God. And so what happens? Samson goes down, down, down. Every time you read him, he's getting in more and more trouble because he's led by his gut. He's led by his appetite. He's not at all led by the Spirit of God. He's got the power of God, but he has none of the heart of God. Now compare that with Paul. Paul tells us that our real strength is found in our weaknesses. that you have to humble yourself. And it's in those areas where you're weakest that God is most active and most likely to meet you and most likely to use you. It's not just being strong and powerful and articulate. It's also being humble and broken and surrendered and all the stuff we hate that we would never want to go through in our lives. You know, think about like a beautiful orchid. You know, when you go through the grocery and they have all these orchids, all these beautiful colors, and they're like $25. They're beautiful, right? I mean, they're just so beautiful, right? And imagine if you had an orchid. I don't know. Is it a bush? Is it a plant? What is it? I don't know. It's not a tree. I don't know. It's a bush. Something. You have an orchid something in your yard, okay? And then you got this beautiful orchid. Let's say it's all kinds of beautiful colors. And oh, it's so wonderful. Oh, so beautiful. Oh, see pictures of it. Okay. So you got this beautiful orchid in your yard. What happens? A hurricane. What's going to happen to that orchid in a hurricane? It's going to be destroyed. Because it's so fragile. It's so it's so beautiful. It's maybe one of the prettiest plants we know of, but yet in a hurricane, it doesn't stand a chance. It's going to be devastated in a hurricane. I have a avocado tree in my backyard that Ken Heffley gave to me before he passed away, and I planted it in my yard. It's huge now. It's got tons of avocados, and they were all just about ripe when the last hurricane came through, and then I had a yard full of avocados. You can't eat that many avocados at one time. I'm telling you, you can't do it, right? I had a yard full of them. My neighbor had a yard full of them. The neighbor down the street had a yard full of them. It was a big hurricane. What's going to happen to that orchid in a hurricane? It's going to be destroyed. Now, compare that with like those old live oak trees. You know, those old live oak trees with the gnarly branches that almost come all the way down to the ground. You know, how many hurricanes have they been through? Those trees are 100 years old, 200 years old, 300 years old, and they've been through, what, 4 or 5 hurricanes, 2 hurricanes a year on average? And they're not in danger much at all. Every once in a while, you know, the moss will get blown out of them, but a couple of branches break, but that tree's not going anywhere. Why? Because it's rooted down, it's strong. Now, it's not as beautiful, maybe as a delicate, colorful orchid, but in a hurricane, the tree, the oak tree, is going to stand. Well, you have storms that come up in your life. And what Paul's doing is he's pointing at a bunch of orchids and he's saying, look, I know they're beautiful, I know they're fantastic, I know they're wonderful, but do they have any roots? What's going to happen when the storms come? You know what happens when the storms come? They're going to run. They're going to flee because they're not really shepherds. They're hirelings that are in it for the money. They're in it for the prestige. They're in it for the position, but they're not in it for the kingdom. And when the hurricanes come, when the testing comes, by the way, you know, you're going to have some hurricanes and some storms, real life storms that come into your life, like divorce, like death, like sickness, like epilepsy, like, I mean, there's a whole long list of stuff, right, that you guys are going through. We're going through financial hardships, financial problems, work problems. You lose your job. You think everything's going great. You lose your job. This kind of stuff happens in real life. This is real life. Right. And you wouldn't choose this nonsense. Nobody would say, yes, I want to go into that. Yes, I want to go through that. Yes, I want to have a difficult marriage where we don't talk to each other. I want to argue all the time. I want to have kids that end up in jail. Nobody would choose these things that will happen in your life. And it's in those times that you think, what's God doing? Why is he allowing this to happen? Why am I going through this? I love him and I sing his praises and I give and I try to be faithful. And why is God allowing this into my life? And some things you're never going to understand. You're not going to understand them in this world. And if your God is understandable, then he's not big enough that you should worship him. God is not understandable and his ways are not understandable, and he's going to let trouble into our lives. But you know what? When that hurricane destroys that orchid, what happens to its seeds? Where do the seeds go? The same hurricane that might decimate the orchid casts the seeds everywhere, and maybe to even more fertile soil. And we don't understand always why God allows the problems, the troubles, the trials, the hardships in our lives. But we know that all things work together for his purpose. And your calamity, whatever it is right now, Your calamity that you're going through, that's a great word, isn't it? Calamity. It's the word that you use to translate when God lets bad stuff happen in your life. He's not bad, but he lets bad stuff happen in your life. Why does he let this calamity into your life? I don't know. And you don't either. But I can tell you this, your calamity is not your identity. And sometimes it becomes our identity. And you know, the enemy will do whatever it takes for you to forget who you truly are. You're a child of God. And let's make sure that we're more like the oak tree, rooted, grounded, strong. And see, I can't see that always, but you know what? When the storm comes, I might be able to see it. And Paul's got all kinds of storms coming at him all the time. And look at chapter 11, verse 5. I don't think I am in the least inferior to those super apostles. You guys have your super apostles. Now, maybe some of these teachers are godly, but probably a lot of them are not. And Paul knows they're not because he knows what the truth is. I mean, you know what the truth is? You can see through the deception. If you don't know what the truth is, then the people that are deceiving you have the ability to deceive you. But once you know what the truth is, you can see through the deception. And Paul sees through their deception that these guys are in it for the money. They're in it for the prestige. They're in it for the power. They love the positions at the end of the table. They love the respect. They love all of the trappings that come with being a leader, except leading people. That's what they don't do. They don't care about people. They're in it for themselves. And he says, I don't feel inferior to your super apostles. And he's not saying that because he thinks they're super. He's saying it because they think they're super. Look at what he says. I may indeed be untrained as a speaker. See what he's saying? He's saying, look, maybe I don't have the pedigree they have. They graduated from Harvard. They graduated from Princeton. They graduated from Yale. They've got all the right, the senator signed their ordination papers. I get it. So they're fantastic. They're wonderful. They're amazing. But one of the criticisms they had for Paul, listen to this. You're not going to believe this. One of the criticisms that they had for Paul was when Paul comes to your church to speak to you, he never charges money. Well, he's fake. Because everywhere I go, I get a $10,000 fee. I get a $10,000 fee. You want me to come speak to you? $10,000. Now, look how I think as a guy, right? I mean, some of these, like Bill Clinton, what does he make? $1 million when he speaks somewhere? Obama, they make like $1 million whenever they go speak. Oprah, how much do they pay these people? They're like $1 million, $10 million. Well, imagine that if you were going to bring in Chuck Swindoll, I think he's still alive. Chuck Swindoll, Charles Stanley's not. But if you're going to bring in one of these people, there's going to be a fee. Well, you could look at the fee as a sign of how important this person is. How much does it cost to get Tom LaHue to come? I like $100. $100, fried chicken. You got me. I'm there. Right? And this is the way Paul was. Paul's like, you guys think because a preacher charges a hefty fee that makes him important. Paul says, look, I'm not doing it for the money. I came and I wasn't a burden. I was a tent maker. I literally worked a job and collected money from other churches who sent me to your church as a missionary. And you despise me because of that, because I didn't charge you a fee. The gospel is freely given and it's freely shared. And because I don't charge an exorbitant fee, I didn't even say the word right, exorbitant fee, because I don't charge this hefty fee on you, you minimize the importance of my ministry. You guys aren't thinking straight, but that's the way they thought. And he says, I preach the gospel free of charge to you. I robbed other churches who supported me to work in your church. I should have charged you. I wasn't a burden to anyone. And then here, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but here's the best part of the sermon. This is where he gets like really, okay, look what he says, verse 13. He says, these false apostles, they are very wonderful. They are eloquent speakers. You know why they are? Because even Satan masquerades as an angel of light. Look at what he says. Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. It's not surprising when his servants also masquerade as servants of righteousness. Their end will be what their actions deserve. Only God knows who truly is with them and who's in it for themselves. And when you see somebody being amazing and wonderful and flashy and exciting, don't forget, so was Lucifer. Lucifer, the light bearer, he was amazing. He was wonderful. He was flashy. So it's no surprise that he could help false preachers and false apostles also seem. But only God knows. And one day God's going to sort it all out. God's going to judge it. So why are you judging which one really, this one, that one? You're sitting there with your scorecards after every sermon, letting me know how you feel about everything in the church. When ultimately, God's the judge. Yeah. Look for somebody whose heart's fully devoted. And then there's this last thing. I'm not even going to read it all because it's too much. But if you read the last part of chapter 11, Paul goes through a list. His resume. He goes through his resume. So these guys, you look at their resume and you're like, graduated honors of his class, won over, the Senate with his amazing ability to speak, held a position in the courts. So they've got these beautiful resumes. And look at what Paul says is my resume. He says, are they servants of Christ? I am more. I have worked much harder. I've been in prison more. Look at his resume. I've been in prison more than they have. I've been flogged more severely than they were. I was exposed to death again and again. 5 times I was whipped with 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. Danger in rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my fellow Jews, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the country, danger at sea, danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food, cold, naked. And in addition to all of this suffering, there's the burden I have for the churches that never goes away. What have they done? And see, greatness in the Christian faith, greatness in the disciples' life isn't about how high you attain. It's about what you're willing to let go of, what you're willing to surrender. Our losses matter. Our losses are important. And what Paul does is he points to all of the suffering and all of the sacrifice and all of the hardship that being a disciple has brought him. He says, look at the way I've been tested, and yet I'm still in the game. Yet the story is not over. You may not know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. And Paul's saying, look, that's it. He's all I've got sometimes. There's this movie a poster out on the wall right outside the door that's advertising the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's an interesting story who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, but let's just say he's a Christian. One of the quotes I love from Bonhoeffer, listen to this, okay? He says, we must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. God will be constantly crossing our paths and canceling our plans. Paul, his path was interrupted many times. What he intended to do, what he wanted to do, what he was setting off to do, and then there would come trouble, shipwrecks, hardships, challenges, and in all this, remained faithful. Can you say that about these super apostles that you give so much attention to and so much respect to? The real test is can we make it through the storms? Can we make it through the challenges? Can we make it through the difficulties and the hardships? God, we thank you, Lord, for your love for us. We thank you for your mercy and grace. We thank you that you're here with us. Help us to remember we're not called to be successful. We're called to be faithful. Help us to have the humility that we see in the Apostle Paul. Help us to have discernment, to know when we're hearing the truth and when we're just hearing the wisdom of man, to be able to discern truth from lies. and the humility to surrender, to give up our freedoms,